Today we're talking with Stan Partlow, who had an amazing law enforcement career, spent several years as a police officer, moving up through the ranks, sergeant, lieutenant, ultimately commander, retiring and having an equally successful private sector. We're talking with him about managing guard forces, what the transition was like from security to law enforcement, how cybersecurity and technology fit in with physical security. Hope you enjoy the conversation.
Quality trained security officers and virtual officers.
We are here today with Stan Partlow. And Stan, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. I was going to start with a brief introduction. When I say brief, I've got to keep my notes straight here. You've got a heck of a background in resume, so I'll try and sum this up the best I can. But it's an impressive background. But thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ryan. I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to having a great conversation today. And hopefully we can help some folks think about issues a little differently than they might be thinking about them today. And if we did, I think that's a win.
I agree. Your background, one, I wanted to kind of recap your law enforcement experience and talk a little bit about your transition from law enforcement into the private sector. But as we kind of get to that piece too, then I think your background with selecting guard companies and managing guard forces through that might be an interesting discussion for security directors and managers out there that are doing the same thing. And finally, I think kind of talking a little bit about technology and how cyber and physical converge together might be an interesting discussion. But just wanted to quickly kind of your background. You have a very extensive education, law enforcement, and also private sector. I mean, you've got a quite a resume here. But from a college standpoint, sounds like you were a graduate. You got your undergrad at Bowling State, Masters of Science Administration from Central Michigan University, and then Juris Doctor, Capital University School of Law. Is that a fair assessment of your educational background?
Yep, I got my bachelor's degree at Bowling Green the old-fashioned way and just went, right out of high school. And then later in my career, I decided I wanted to go back to school, and I ended up going to getting my master's degree and my law degree back to back in about 6 years, which I can testify you cannot do alone, and you have to have a village around you. And my incredible wife was certainly center in that and helped me do that because I was working full time, at 3 kids, and like a lot of people I'm sure that are listening to this podcast, trying to make it all work. So I was very blessed and had lots of opportunities, but I'm a lifelong learner, and I'm really an advocate of kind of the Stephen Covey school of, we have to continue to sharpen our saws. And if you ever read 7 Habits, he talks about that. You can't ever stop. And even today, I'm an old guy now, but I haven't, I just finished up a coaching certification program, a year-long program, learning how to coach people. And I'm now in the practicum piece where I'm gaining hours of real experience. So I don't ever see myself stopping, that learning opportunity. And in the security business, of course, there's lots and lots of different things that you can do to continue to sharpen your saw.
I agree. Yeah, that's a evolving process that never seems to end. But well, and then from a law enforcement perspective, so you started at the police department in Columbus. Looks like you worked there for a couple of years and had a short stint at the FBI.
Yeah, so I was a police officer in Columbus for 4 years, and then having an opportunity to go to the bureau, and back in that time frame in the late '80s, getting your orders to New York was a pretty sobering experience. And I was stationed in Raleigh, North Carolina. I spent 4 years there and had a wonderful time. I wouldn't trade 1 minute of my FBI career, but getting that notification that I was headed to New York when I had 2 little girls. My wife and I just really took a hard assessment of our life and what it was going to look like if we took the transfer to New York. And we made the decision to come back home. And I was blessed that I was actually able to come back to Columbus, which is home base for both of us, and rejoin the department, and then work through the rest of my career and retired in 2005. So I always tell people the 2 greatest decisions I ever made in my life were, one, besides marrying my wife, one was to join the FBI and the other one was to leave. And again, I wouldn't trade a minute of it. But at that time, going to New York 1988 was a tough road. So,
Yeah.
we just made a family decision that we wanted to focus on the kids and bring them back to, their grandparents and their cousins, and so that's what we did. And I don't regret that decision at all.
Nice. Well, yeah, it seems like once you got back to Columbus, you were there for quite a while, worked up through the ranks, officer, sergeant, lieutenant, finally commander, and retiring. But I mean, that's a quick summation of a bunch of different stuff. I mean, you had some SWAT experience, some narcotics, and all sorts of different stuff. Anything that sticks out over the time there, law enforcement wise, before retiring in 2005?
Well, certainly the opportunity to rise to the ranks was huge when I transitioned into the private sector. One of the things that I always struggle with when I talk to people that are thinking about making that transition, a lot of police officers want to be, they want to be security managers or security directors, and they've never supervised anyone.
Right.
And when they talk to me, I respectfully tell them, hey, as a CSO, which was the last position I had in the private sector, I was a vice president. I had directors reporting to me, managers, supervisors. And I said, I don't have time to teach you how to lead people. And
Right.
while being a police officer is an incredibly honorable position, it's a rewarding position. It's an incredible opportunity. Then leading people is a little bit different. So I was blessed that I had the opportunity to do that at 3 different levels within a pretty good sized organization. Columbus PD, City of Columbus is the 14th largest city in the United States. Columbus PD, I don't know what the number is now, but generally hovered around 1,900, 2,000 police officers ish.
Wow.
So good sized department, and I was at a commander level, so I was in charge of a bureau, and then there were 5 deputy chiefs and the chief. So senior level position, and you learn something different at every position, which was an interesting thought process for me, because I think when we are, especially police officers, we always think we can do the boss's job. But until you become the boss, you don't recognize how hard that can be sometimes. So, I always tell people that, hey, if your dream is to be a security director, you probably need to get some legitimate management experience within the law enforcement community before you retire and try to do that. Probably the other thing that that I really relished in my career is I had the opportunity to spend 7 years as a hostage negotiator in Columbus. And that was an eye-opening experience, and probably taught me how to interact with people in a much different way than I did when I was on the enforcement side. And so, it's you kind of take that whole career and you look at it, the whole thing, and you say, wow, I had an opportunity to do a lot of different things, and I think that helped prepare me when I went to the private sector. So, I would tell people, one of the great things about law enforcement is, especially if you're in a decent sized department, there's all kinds of opportunities to do many different things, and you should take advantage of all the things that that make sense to you, and get your juices flowing, and don't hesitate, jump on that and get all that experience, because it'll help you down the road.
Nice. No, I agree. The management side and leadership side seems to be what drives the needle everywhere. I found that kind of in my own position is sometimes I feel like I'm not necessarily in the security business, I'm more in the people business, but getting that management thing is definitely important. So about 2005, that was about the time to retire. Did you have plans and a job offer going into the private sector already, or what kind of led to you thinking, hey, it's time to hang this up and maybe try my chops in the private side?
Yeah, so one of those kind of strange sets of circumstances, which happens a lot in life. My best friend had already transitioned into the private sector. The job at AEP for the director of physical security came open, and he said, "Hey, you need to apply for this job." And I said, "Well, I don't think I'm ready to leave law enforcement yet." And I want to hang around here because I was at the level that I would have had the opportunity to at least compete for the next chief or deputy chief slot. So, I'm the middle of 3 generations of police officers. My dad spent 25 years in the business. me. Now my oldest daughter and her husband are there now. So, this is the thin blue line runs pretty deep in my family. And I thought, well, what a way to cap off my career by getting at least the second to the top job, or maybe the top job. He kept kind of encouraging me, and he said something that turned into be a big joke later on, but he was right. He said, look, you've never, ever in your life been through a job interview. And I said, whoa. And he's right, because any of us that have been in law enforcement or in the military recognize that the interview process is not anything close to what you see in the private sector. So his counsel to me was apply for the job, take the interview. If nothing else, do it for the experience, because at some point you're going to decide, I'm ready to go in the private sector, and you'll have that under your belt. Well, lo and behold, I did exactly what he told me to do. And then I get a phone call that they offered me the job. And I called him and I said, well, what do I do now? And he said, well, take the job, you dummy. So that's kind of how I ended up there. It really wasn't, I knew I wanted to be in the private sector at some point. But honestly, in 2005, I don't think that was my target.
Right.
But, I had the opportunity. And one of the things you have to look at, too, is, today, the world has changed a lot with the remote workforce. But think about 2005. We didn't have anything like that. There were no hybrid jobs or remote jobs. So I looked in Columbus, Ohio, which, again, 14th, 15th largest city in the United States at the time. And actually, there were probably a handful of jobs at the level that I wanted where I would have been able to stay in Columbus and not move to, DC or New York or Chicago or wherever. Right. And so I looked at that too, because that's one of the things that you have to think really hard about when you're thinking about moving to the private sector. There's a big timing component there. And so I thought to myself, if I pass on this job, and then 3 or 4 years down the road, I'm now, in my mind, ready to go. This job may not be available. And oh, by the way, the other 4 or 5 jobs at the level that I wanted may not be available either. And so now I don't have any options. So that was another thing that really weighed in my thinking is, from a timing perspective, if I don't jump on this, I may, again, get down the road and say, okay, now it's time for me to go, and there's no option. So again, one of those other sort of serendipitous things that happened to me, and I'm glad I did it. I don't regret making the decision. Who knows what would have happened if I would have hung around, if I would have had the opportunity to go to another level or 2 higher in the division. But this was a great ride, and I did it for 15 years. The one thing, though, that I think is critical is that you have to be prepared to make the jump. Yeah. So I had done all the training and education and, sort of created me, if you will, as a senior executive leader in the police, in the division of police. And so the transition to the private sector, I think I was ready for it. And I think that's important. I had the opportunity to be on Carlos Francisco's podcast. And for any of your listeners that don't know Carlos, if you're thinking about transitioning, go get his book. The title of the book is So You Want to Be in Corporate Security. Listen to his podcast. He has great guests on, not me, but lots of other smart people. Great book. But what he talks about, and what he and I talked about, was you really have to start thinking about this pretty early. If you maybe got a 25-year window for your career, and you start thinking about transitioning to the private sector at the 24th year, 10th month, you are not going to get the job that you want. You really start having a plan way ahead, start creating your network, getting those relationships, learning about the private security industry. And I think that's one of the things that was a big shock to me is, I sit there and say, hey, I'm a big city police executive, if you will. Certainly, I know how to be a security director. And what I found out was I knew nothing about private security. I knew nothing about the corporate world. And my learning curve was pretty steep, even though I think I had prepared pretty well, because it's a different job. It's a different focus. It's a different emphasis. It's a different, those of us that grew up in the command and control environment, now all of a sudden you're in these flat organizations where collaboration is the key. You don't get to give people orders. You don't get to enforce policies. And it's a big mindset change for people. So it's something you definitely have to start thinking about way ahead. And I think I did that. And so the timing presented itself. I went through the process. They offered me the job. I took the leap. Again, this is a family decision, right? This is one you want to involve your significant other and your kids and everybody, because I think the other thing that you find out about corporate security versus your law enforcement career is, most people, especially at senior levels in law enforcement, when it's about 3:30, 4 o'clock, they're headed for home.
Right.
Sometimes in the private sector, that's when your day begins. And after you've worked a full day, and then it's like, man, I got to be here another 5-6 hours. And it's not that we haven't done that in our past, but you developed kind of, as you said, that cadence of saying, hey, I might be on call, but I'm not going to be in the office past 3:30, 4 o'clock. Well, the private sector doesn't necessarily work that way, so you've got to prepare yourself for that. So again, had a great opportunity and took it, and was there 15 years, and then finally, after 40 years, I was like, yeah, it's time for me to hang it up and try to figure out what I want to be when I grow up.
Sure. Well, now it's like you've developed all of the different pieces. You've got the law enforcement background, the education, the private sector, and kind of, it's the whole product. But I totally agree. When you've got to build those things. If law enforcement is all you've got on the resume, I think the two big things that stick out are the networking aspect of it, and also the education piece of how do you show the complete package. Because like you said, law enforcement, some of it does, the technical side of things, there's, access control systems and cameras and SEPTED and all sorts of different things that never come up in a law enforcement discussion. Budgets too are one. In law enforcement, I was never on the command side of things where I had any interaction with budgets and different times like that. But when you're a cop, the way you're measured is not in how much profit you're bringing or where, meeting budgets and everything else. And that's a whole different, it comes into that in the dollars and cents. Did you have some exposure to that in your kind of brass experience on the law enforcement side, or was that kind of sticker shock for you when you got to the private side?
A little bit of both. So yes, I did have some experience because one of my commander jobs, I had 3 commander jobs. One of my commander jobs was the commander of the Technical Services Bureau, which was a job that no one wanted because it was kind of a non-police job. I had facilities, fleet, the ID section, records, the photo lab, the print shop, sort of all the back office stuff. It not a glamorous job, and a lot of the commanders were, like, I don't want any part of that. I also had the IT network for the Division of Police job. But I tell you, I learned a lot about that process you just talked about. I learned a lot about budgeting and spending money and having to be accountable. We had a lot of grant projects that we worked, and there was accountability there. But even with all that, to your point, the budgeting process that happens in law enforcement is much different than what happens in the corporate world, because basically they come to you, the leadership comes to you and says, you have this much money to spend. And if you spend more than that, nobody's going to fire you, right? Because you just say, well, hey, we had a tough year and we had a lot of overtime, and our homicide rate was way up. My last job was the commander of the Detective Bureau. So I had all the investigative functions except for narcotics and juvenile. So, my detectives worked overtime based upon the crimes that were happening in the city. I blew through my overtime budget, and it's like, okay. But to your point, in the corporate world, you blow through your budget, you got a problem.
Right.
And then there's that idea, and I tell you, one of the sticker shock side for me that was so very difficult was when you have to do a reduction in force. And in the law enforcement world, you really never have to do that.
Right.
But in the corporate world, when the money starts really getting tight, all of a sudden, we know that, and especially in your business, labor is the number one commodity. That's the number one O&M expense. And so you're asked to cut your budget 10%. Well, there's not a lot of places you can cut except for labor. And now you're telling people, hey, you no longer have a job. That was horrible. And I had to do it a few times, and I never, ever relished it. I never enjoyed it. It was miserable, but it's a difference, in that environment. You have to get used to that, because that's part of the way that environment works. So, I think there was a little bit of both for me, but I was blessed that I had an opportunity to manage some functions that were more like corporate, than straight up law enforcement. I mean, I loved my other commander job was being a patrol commander, which was fantastic. Being out there with the officers, the city of Columbus is broken up into 5 zones. I had 24/7 responsibility for one of those zones. That was a gas.
Yeah.
But from a learning perspective, not so much. Actually the technical services role probably helped me more than anything I ever did transition into the private sector.
Yeah, getting stretched that way, especially the IT side, I'm sure was extremely beneficial. So when you made that transition, were there any other surprises or any other things that either you were unprepared for or struggled with? That the time thing is interesting because I had the same experience. I thought one of the motivations for me to leave law enforcement and go into the private sector was I was sick of the shift work, having uncut, and then you get in the private sector and you're like, I work more now than I ever did. And so it didn't necessarily translate that way. There's a little bit more stability and it's a little bit more, family friendly as far as the hours that you're keeping and not being home at all hours of the night. But any other things that stand out when you were kind of in that 2006, because you also had the 08 downturn in the economy,
right?
Did that play in at all? Because that had to be early on in your
that was really difficult to experience. That the company went through a pretty good size, a pretty significant downsizing from the time I got hired into that 08 actually through 10 kind of time frame, and sort of a gradual reduction in force. And so that was difficult. I mean, that was a real challenge to weather that storm, and also to learn how to manage yourself in the organization. One of the things that was interesting is that when you're in a law enforcement or a military world, everybody came from the same place you did.
Right.
You don't have to explain things to them. That's one of the things that I think is unique, especially in the first responder community, is no matter what color your badge is, whether it's silver or gold, whether it says police officer or chief, everybody started pushing that cruiser around. So it's not like you have to explain to people how that stuff works. When you go into a private sector environment, especially as a security professional, you're a subject matter expert in a field and a topic that has nothing to do with the business.
Right.
Unless it's a business like yours. Obviously, there's a little dip. But I worked in an electric utility company.
Right.
Full of engineers and brilliant people that understood how to move electricity from point A to point B. They had no understanding of security. And so all of a sudden, I'm in this environment where I'm having to educate people at the senior executive level about a topic that they're really not familiar with, and figure out a way to talk to them in a way that made sense. Because, we in the law enforcement and military community are so heavy on our jargon, because to us, we get it. We understand.
It makes sense.
It always breaks my heart when I see a resume come across my desk and it's full of jargon. And I'm thinking, I get that, but the HR people don't get that. They're like, what does this mean? What all these initials and little code, I mean, they don't have a clue what any of that stuff means. So one thing I would say to your listeners, if you're really thinking about, and Carlos talks about it in his book, and I know he's talked about it on the podcast, if you're really serious about, going into the corporate world, think about either getting a corporate mentor of some kind, or even paying somebody to write your resume, because you have great skills and they translate. But if you write them the way your career went, they will not work, because it doesn't make sense. So one of the things I settled on was, after a number of years of trying to figure out how to, have these conversations, what I really centered on was having them in terms of risk. Because one of the things you learn pretty quickly is that senior executives understand risk management, whether it's financial risk or supply chain risk, or marketing risk, or risk to intellectual property. If you're in that kind of business where you've got a lot of IP, or if you're running a manufacturing plant with industrial control systems, risk to those. So if you can figure out a way to turn the security conversation into a risk-based conversation, now that becomes a game changer. Instead of trying to educate them on the widgets and the things that that they really don't really want to spend the effort and time to understand. So that's a real interesting dynamic is, when you present something to the command staff in a law enforcement agency, a fire agency, or in the military, everybody in the room knows exactly what you're talking about.
Right.
And then you go to the corporate world and no one in the room knows what you're talking about except you.
Right.
And you got to try to figure out a way to put it in terms that they'll appreciate and understand, and make sure that you're not trying to do the old dance where you're baffling them with your brilliance or dazzling them with the BS, if you will, because they'll catch on to that right away. So you've got to be able to. So I think that was a real eye opener for me, because I'd never been outside of my law enforcement environment. I mean, 25 years. I started when I was 21 years old, and that was the only thing that I knew. So getting exposed to that, my first few presentations were a little bit rocky.
Right.
And I'm very blessed that I had some really great mentors within the company that helped me and spent time with me and said, hey, here's how you do this. Here's how you need to tell this story. But you have to be able to put your ego in your back pocket. And
Right.
that in and of itself is hard for a lot of security professionals, particularly those that came from law enforcement, fire, and the military, because they have healthy egos, and they have healthy egos for a reason. So you've really got to be willing to say, okay, I don't know anything about this business. And that was one of the things that I think I also really tried very hard, to learn the business, to develop business acumen.
Right.
And I think that's an important piece when you transition to the private sector. If you're in the guard business, or you're in the technology business, or you're in a utility or a bank, or a university setting, whatever it is, you need to learn that business. You
Right.
might understand security, and you might understand crisis management and all the things you learned in your first responder career, but you need to learn the business. So I actually went to a course that was actually a really good course that my company sponsored, that helped us understand kind of the electric utility business, which I knew nothing about. And
Right.
I worked in one of the largest electric utility companies in the United States, and we operated in 11 states, and we were regulated by the utility commissions in those 11 states. There's a whole process called rate making, which determines how the company makes money. The company's publicly traded. There were lots of lessons to learn about all of that stuff. And I became a sponge, and I wanted to learn everything that I possibly could about the business, so that when I was thinking about how I was going to position a security project, or do we really need to have a guard force at that particular plant, and how are we going to pay for that? How does that fit into the bottom line? Then I developed that understanding of how the business actually works, so that when I made those presentations, I could talk about this in terms of the business. Well, this is the way, I went and talked to the rate making folks, and this is the way we could expect this to be treated in rate making. And you'd see the head nods around the table. If you just walk in and say, hey, I need to go spend $1 million on X, they look at you like, okay, where's that coming from? You have it in your budget? And usually the answer is no. Well, where are you going to get that money? What's the payback look like? Is there going to be an ROI for the organization based upon the investment that you're asking us to make?
And that's such a good point, because knowing the audience and knowing how to, sell it or quantify it type of thing is the important piece, because, I look at some of those positions, security directors and managers, as kind of the quarterback. How do they bridge the gap and communicate between the C-suite, the IT department, the boots on the ground, and kind of talking? Those are all different conversations. And, one of the things that we find when we're talking with customers is, are the decisions being made, does that roll up through finance, or does that roll up through operations? Because the finance people speak a different language. They want to know ROI. It can maybe be more of a commodity, or do we need it, as opposed to, because we're looking at one thing, it's security. They're looking at 10 different things, and you're going, I need $1 million for this. And they're going, okay, where am I going to pull that from or move it? And speaking that language to justify it is definitely
and there's a third aspect to that too, especially in big companies, is the procurement group.
Yes.
Which may have its own culture, its own set of rules, its own issues. And if you're the end user, the operational person like I was, you have to be able to work with them, because to your point, they're working with the finance team and they have their own set of rules. Amazingly enough, one of the things that I did in my corporate career was I actually was responsible for the procurement function for AEP.
Really?
To this day, I don't know how that happened. There was some challenges that group was facing. My boss asked me if I would take it over and still keep the security group, which I did, and I did. But I learned a lot because, to your point, you might think you understand how to put together an RFI or an RFP if you're going to like as an example, if I was going to hire a new guard company, but understanding what it looks like on the other side of that with the internal procurement group and what all their rules are and what they're looking for, boy, that made me a lot better educated when I didn't have that responsibility anymore and I kept growing my organization. I had a nice bird's eye view. So one of the things I always suggest to people is, and you said it a little bit earlier, a lot of times this is a people issue, right? It's not a technology or a technical issue. And if you are able to establish within your company that you're bigger than being a security person because you're a leader and you have the ability to lead people, it's amazing the kind of offers that you may get. I ran our motor vehicle fleet for 3 years. I had 60 garages and 300 and some fleet technicians and about 20,000 pieces of rolling stock. I was buying 150-foot bucket trucks, if you can imagine that. And I'm a cop.
Right.
But I learned who my folks that I needed to rely on, my expertise or my experts in that area. And at the end of the day, it was a leadership issue for me to make sure that the people were taken care of and we got the mission accomplished. So, I had lots of opportunities that I would have never expected, but I was always open to them. And when they came to me and said, I ran our aviation group for 15 years. Hey, will you be in charge of the airplanes? I said, sure, I'll do it. I didn't know anything about aviation, but I have some really smart people that did, and we worked together and made it happen.
Well, that sounds like it's a credit to your leadership skills. I mean, it seems like they're tapping you for that and going, do we want to give it to somebody that has experience in aviation, or do we want somebody that's going to be a really good leader that can learn that piece of it? And that those leadership skills are valuable. That I think picking that piece for sure. Curious, when you were talking about overseeing procurement, when you were at the power utility, did security roll up under operations or finance? Ultimately, at the top, who did your team report up to?
So when I first started, we rolled up to basically an organization that was called Shared Services, and I think I found that in the utility space that was pretty common. So that was a lot of the back office stuff, facilities, the motor vehicle fleet, IT, sometimes HR, and security. So it was kind of that. This is not our core business, but these are all the things that we need to make the core business function, and they group those all together. When I was able to converge the cyber and the physical organization into what now is the CSO organization, and I became the chief security officer, I actually reported directly to the chief operating officer, which was, and I hope we get a chance to talk about that a little bit and how valuable that was. And when the person that was in that position retired, and they didn't fill it initially, so then I went to the general counsel's office. So I never reported to the finance chain.
Interesting.
And yeah, so, but you know what I find when I talk to my peers, at least in the utility space, you could kind of draw a map of the company with the org charts on there, and it looks like sometimes the senior executive team are closing their eyes and taking the dart and going, "Oh, it landed."
I don't know there. Yeah.
Yeah. Because in a lot of ways, it just doesn't fit cleanly. Because as I said earlier, it's not part of the core business.
Right.
So you have to make yourself as the leader of that organization, you have to make yourself indispensable to those people that are running the part of the core business. And the quicker you do that, the more successful you'll be. And it's amazing. You'll find opportunities to do things that are maybe beyond the initial scope of what you started with. And I would just tell people, encourage people, if you get that opportunity, don't turn it down. Don't sit there and go, well, that's not really in my wheelhouse. Make it in your wheelhouse. Figure it out. Learn how to do it. One of the great things about first responders is that first responders can figure out anything if they're given time. If they're willing to invest themselves, You think about all the things that you did as a police officer, you talk to a firefighter, you talk to someone in the military. It's the same story over and over again. They all do things that are outside their comfort zone, and they figure out how to do it. They're great at it. And so a lot of times I think people will come into the security space and sort of create their own box and say, well, I can't move outside of that box. I volunteered for every project I could get my hands on. I volunteered to sit on cross-functional teams that had nothing to do with what I was responsible for. One, to get me the exposure to other leaders in the company. Two, to learn more about the business. And three, you never know where that next opportunity is going to come from. And if they understand that you have the capability of being able to lead people, to make presentations, to do critical thinking, to be creative, you never know.
Right. No, that's great advice. And well, I want to talk a little bit about kind of your interaction with the Guard Force and your time at the utility company. Before moving on to that, I wanted to ask you one more thing about the transitioning from law enforcement. Carlos's stuff is great. I want to throw a link up to that if anybody's interested in that and is in law enforcement and thinking about transitioning. It's great information. On the flip side of that, do you think the law enforcement experience is crucial to your success in those positions? Do you have any advice to somebody that may not have come up through the law enforcement chain? Is that a prerequisite? Is that necessary? Would you advise them to go get some law enforcement experience, or what would you tell those folks?
I think that's a great observation, Ryan. And I would say that making these career changes is like playing golf. You got to play the ball where it lies. Yeah. And you need to highlight your strengths, no matter which side of the business you grew up in. Because what we're seeing now, in my view, in a post 9/11 world, we have a whole generation of people that are taking security leadership positions today and that are being groomed to take them in the next 10 years that have no law enforcement experience, no military experience. And I think that's perfectly fine. If you think about the transition that happened, and I was in the law enforcement world during 9/11, and if you looked at the pre 9/11 security managers, directors, whatever they were called, 99 times out of 100, they were retired cops.
Yep.
And the job was much different. It was low key, very small organizations, had its own pace, and it was literally a guy like me, a captain, commander, lieutenant, whatever, in a police department, goes and gets a job as a security director for a company. There's 3 people in the organization, and what they did was spend their time drinking coffee with their old buddies, right? 9/11 happens, game changer, the world changes, the way we look at security changes, your business in the Guard Force changes dramatically. All of a sudden now we're into this public-private partnership. We're thinking about security completely differently, particularly in my industry where we have critical infrastructure. The senior executive team is looking at risk differently. And now we're grooming people to come through a real legitimate security pipeline, which I think is awesome.
I do, yeah.
No, I don't think that there's a prerequisite to be in law enforcement, to be a security person. I think you can learn the security business, and in some ways, you may be ahead of the people that were in law enforcement because you understand the security piece differently. I would say, though, that one thing that the law enforcement community, the first responder community, whether it's law enforcement, fire service, or the military, brings to the table is crisis management.
Yep.
It's interesting when I look at this whole idea of convergence, which again I think is a topic near and dear to my heart. People said to me, explain to me how you're running cybersecurity for a Fortune 150, 175 company.
Right.
And I said, because the reason that I'm running cybersecurity for that company is not because I'm a cybersecurity expert, but what I do have some legitimate, solid experience in is crisis management. Because anyone that's ever been a police officer, firefighter, military person, particularly those at a command level, have experienced crisis management up close and personal, and they're very comfortable in that role. What I saw on the cyber side of the house many times, brilliant people that had never managed a crisis ever.
Right.
And so when you get to the place where your company is under attack, if you will,
right,
it's not as much about the technical piece as it is how do we manage the crisis. So I would say to those up and coming security folks that are coming through the security pipeline, don't there's no reason for you to go jump into law enforcement. If you're happy, you're comfortable there, keep your nose to the grindstone, but look for opportunities to develop your crisis management skills, because that's the piece that I think will separate you. And I think that's the reason that a lot of senior executives gravitate toward law enforcement, military, fire service folks, because that's an area that they're comfortable in.
Yeah, you're right. That's a great point, because I mean, daily your day goes from zero to managing a crisis and then back to zero, and yeah, you get those reps in. That's a great point for sure. So moving on so now you're full on into your private sector and at the utility company. What was your interaction with the guard force? You did not have an internal proprietary. You had outsourced to guarding companies. Did you have one company? Did you have multiple? I'm kind of interested in your experience with the guard force.
So prior to my getting there, there were multiple guard force companies across the 11 state footprint. And we had, I would say two basic types of businesses where we use the guard force services. One were the power plants, which is, very big industrial, big nasty buildings,
right,
and facilities that are many acres. And then we had office buildings that we used guard force services in. So two kind of different environments that we asked the guards to help us with. Right before I got there, there was an effort to consolidate the companies into one national account, and there's certainly pros and cons to doing both of those. But I will say this: as a security director, working through an 11 state footprint, having a lot of different guard companies to deal with is a challenge.
Sure.
And I saw that because we had just transitioned, and when there was a drop in service, the first thing that happened in the field was people like, see, we should have never done that. We should go back to the smaller guard companies that worked with us. But from my chair, I recognized pretty quickly it would be very difficult to manage that. So one of the things that I did, which was incredibly helpful to me, was as we worked through the contracts, over the course of my 15 years, I always made sure that I had a national account manager that actually worked in my office. So
okay.
That was part of the deal. And I wanted that person. So that person worked for the guard company, but literally sat, 2 doors down from me. And when I had a problem in Oklahoma or Texas or Virginia or whatever, I didn't have to worry about trying to go to some regional manager that was managing the guard force in that area. I could go to my national account manager and say, look, you need to fix this.
Right.
Because one of the interesting dynamics that happens in a national account environment is within the guard companies, and you can name whichever one you want, I think it's the same in all of them, there's this tension between the national account team
yep.
and local boots on the ground.
Yep.
So the local regional manager that's responsible for that little geographic area, he or she has their own, KPIs that they're trying to meet and their own things that they're trying to do. And oftentimes they charge a rate that's higher than what I was paying because I was paying from the national account side.
Right.
So when you aggregate all of my business across 11 states, it was a pretty significant number. To that person, it might have only been, maybe I only had 10 officers. So I wasn't the biggest contract that they had in their area by a long shot, but they still were required to provide me that level of service. So there's always a little bit of tension there. And that was one of the things that I used the national account manager to try to help us work through that. And at least for me, that was a great model. It's really interesting as I watch the guard business and watched it change over my 15 years. There's not a lot of competitors out there now.
It's all the big guys are consolidating by buying the smaller ones up, right. And it's turning into Pepsi and Coke or yep. Local mom and pops and not much in between.
Yeah, that's right. So I think it's important for the security directors to really make some informed choices about the guard companies that they're involved in, because I think the guard business is really unique. And I say that because you have an employee who works for another company who actually is your first line of defense and the face of your guard organization or your security organization. So from my perspective, as a security director, my proprietary guard force or my proprietary security force was very small,
Right.
but I had hundreds of security officers. So for the vast majority of when I started at AEP, there were 24,000 employees. When I left, there were probably 18,000 ish. For the vast majority of those employees, the people that they saw day to day from the security organization were not my team. They were the security officers that staffed those facilities, that were there, at the gate, that were there at the turnstiles when they badged in, that were help, escort them out to their car when they were working until 7, 8, 9, or 10 o'clock at night. So it's really critical, in my view, that a security director does some really good work vetting those companies and make sure that they are bringing people on that are going to represent them, because it's almost like you have to capture that employee's heart in two ways. So you as the owner of your company, have to make sure that those officers are loyal to Titan and that they get your mission, vision, values, and that they're going to be solid employees for you. But then on the other side, me as the AEP security director has to make sure that they are putting the best interests of the AEP employees first and foremost. And for us, it was employee safety was number one. So they had to understand that. So I think the guard business is a really fascinating and unique environment where you've got to be able to figure out a way to work as a partner with the leadership of your guard company. And you both have to recognize that those officers that are literally the boots on the ground, have to understand the mission, vision, values of both organizations and have to embrace them. Right. And hopefully there's no conflict there. And if there is, you need to work that out up front, because you don't want to put them in a bad situation where you've got your proprietary, company person like me asking them to do something that goes counter to, something that you guys in your leadership in your company have decided is important for them to do. So I feel like there's some real partnership that has to happen between the two leadership teams if you're going to have a really solid guard force that's going to make everybody happy.
Well, and that's a great point. And I think, we talked about this earlier about that partnership, and you just touched on it. From our perspective on the guard side, that, everybody says we're looking for that partnership. That is so crucial to the success of it, because the opposite of that is commoditizing the security guard and going, you're the contract company, you guys figure it out and do it. And, there has to be that investment both ways to make that truly a partnership, because you do have to make those officers may not, be on your payroll, but they are the frontline defense, and, you definitely want to make them feel part of the team. So that's a delicate dance to kind of come together. And I couldn't agree more. Our most successful relationships have been when we're working hand in hand and everybody's invested in, the success of it, not just checking a box saying we have security, you figure it out.
And that's exactly right. And I think that the security directors, managers out there that think that they can lay this responsibility off on the guard company are sorely mistaken, because let's play that out. Let's say there's a real blunder and a real error that happens with your security team, and you, meaning me, now has to go to the CEO and explain that. How do you think it plays when I say, well, boss, that's the guard company's problem? Right. He or she is going to look at me and go, no, Stan, that's your problem.
Right.
You own this. It's your contract. You picked them. You vetted them. It's your problem, because it created a problem for the company. So, if you've got folks out there in the audience that are listening that think that, hey, I can keep this at arm's length. Now, granted, there are some arm's length issues you have to do, right, so you don't have co-employment. But if you think that you basically pawn that responsibility off on the security company, I would argue that that's a fatal flaw, because it will come back to haunt you, because it's your shot. And you can't just say, well, the security company screwed up. It's we screwed up, right? We, collective, we, the big we, the security team, the contract guard force team, we collectively screwed up. And if you are going to handle that appropriately, in my estimation, with your senior executive team, meaning mine, you got to take responsibility for that. And you got to say, here's how we're going to make it better. We're going to make sure this never happens again.
Right.
So there's some things that I feel like are important to do to drive that partnership. Some of the things we did at AEP to try to help that is when we hired new security officers, when the company hired new security officers, I sent them a personal letter from me that welcomed them to the team, that outlined the mission, vision, and values of the company. We had pamphlets that we used, within the company. I sent those to them, told them how important their role was. Employee safety was first and foremost. In a big utility company, that's a big deal. And because dealing with electricity, whether you're making it at a generation plant, which is a behemoth of a machine,
Right.
or you're transmitting it across the lines, or you're delivering it to somebody's house, it's a dangerous commodity. And so that idea of employee safety was critical to us, and I made sure those security officers understood that. I would send them congratulatory notes that I hand wrote on their anniversary. We came up with some reward and recognition programs that we worked in partnership with the guard company to put a co-branding on them, which I think worked out really well. And we had some really amazing experiences. We had Officer of the Quarter, Officer of the Year, and I will never forget one experience that I had that touched me so deeply. We selected one of our officers that worked at one of our pretty good sized power plants as the Officer of the Year, based upon some performance that he was engaged in. And the plant manager, when he found out, called me and said, "Hey, we are going to have a huge celebration for this guy.
Wow.
We love him. He's an integral part of our team." And I mean, Ryan, it was unbelievable. It brought a tear to my eye because I went and presented the award along with the vice president for the guard company that was responsible for our contract. They had a luncheon for this guy. They invited his family. They had this huge cake. They bought him a jacket from the plant that had, sort of plant branding on it. I mean, it was amazing how much they loved this guy. And when they found out that he was going to get this award, I will never forget that as long as I live. I was standing there going, wow, this is what it's all about.
Yeah.
We actually were able to make sure that he was integrated into both companies. And the regional vice president that came from the guard company did a phenomenal job talking about, his experience with the company and all that. And it was really one of those beautiful moments in my leadership career where I knew we had done the right thing to recognize this, this employee and do it in a way that his own, AEP team was celebrating his success along with the guard company. So, those were some really, really wonderful moments that I got to participate in. And we were pretty deliberate about it. We wanted to make sure that they felt like they were part of our team. And again, it was really about those conversations early on in the contract and setting some of those things up. One of the things that that we always struggle with I think, and hopefully you would agree with this in the guard business, was, how do we get these folks some more money? And sometimes it's a quarter or 50 cent an hour raise because they have certain steps that they have to jump through. So one of the things that we did was we sat down and said, generally there's a time frame element to their getting promoted within those levels. And what we did was we partnered together and we called it Jump for Success. And we allowed them to jump to another grade if they were willing to undertake an education program that they could do while they were on duty. And it was great because what we ended up with, from my perspective, I was spending a little bit more money on the hourly rate, but I was ending up with a better educated security officer.
Right.
We helped the guard company put the curriculum together. We all agreed on what we wanted them to learn. And we put this thing together. And, when I would go out and the officers would complain about their wage rate, first thing I would say, "Hey, have you enrolled in Jump for Success?" "No."
Right.
Well, after you do that and you get your raise, come back and let's talk, right? It was a way to kind of say, hey, you have some control over your, the amount of money that you're going to be able to bring home for your family if you're willing to invest in yourself. So there's all kinds of creative things that you can do. And I would say to the listeners who are, my peers on the proprietary side, when you get ready to let a new contract or renegotiate even a contract with an existing vendor on the security guard side, sit down with them and say, hey, what can we do to make this better?
And those types of conversations are gold. I mean, to hear that and those types of partnerships from the contract guard side, we bend over backwards for those types of things because that truly feels like a win-win. And two, those types of the education and all of those things, the recognition, that makes that more of a career for these folks as opposed to just a job and collecting a paycheck. And we've done employee surveys. We have 400 plus security officers. The things that are important to them consistently are communication and recognition. Pay and benefits usually come after that. Surprisingly, those are very important, and you've got to have those right things. Those seem to be more pay and benefits seems to be what gets them into company, and the communication and recognition is what keeps them. And that turnover, because keeping them and not having to retrain a new person, your employees like to see a familiar face and the same people and the welcoming and somebody that knows what's going on, not having to show a new security officer the ropes every couple of weeks is huge. So certainly applaud you for that. That's especially from what I see on my side, those types of relationships are certainly what motivate us to do much more in a relationship.
Well, and it's like everything else in life, right, Ryan? You get what you invest in. If you treat those officers like commodities, that's exactly what you're going to get. If you treat that team like partners, that's what you're going to get. And it's interesting to me that, and I don't want this to come across the wrong way from a commodity perspective, but let's be honest, there's a couple of different pools that you're recruiting security officers from. There are the people that are kind of first job out of the gate. They're young. They're looking for an opportunity. They want to get some experience. Some of those folks want to go into law enforcement that may need to wait a period of time before they can get there. So they're thinking in their mind, hey, let me go and get some experience. Let me do some networking because I'm going to be introduced to some people in the law enforcement community. And then oftentimes you're getting people at the other end of their career where they've already done something, for 25, 30, 35 years, and they're looking for a way to supplement that retirement income. And for them, the security space seems to fit. Maybe it's a flexibility issue with the hours. And, amazingly enough, a lot of those people want to work third shift because they've got things going on in their personal lives that make sense to them. And so, when you think about that, when you switch guard companies, the reality is, from my side, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this as well, is that you're dealing with the same pool of people. But the real difference is the relationship you have with the leadership team from the guard company. And because sometimes it literally is a function of they're tearing a patch of one company off of their uniform and sewing a new patch on because the officers themselves that are in the facilities don't necessarily change. But from a security director perspective, I want to know that I have a partner at the leadership level within that company and that they're going to work with me. And I know I have a responsibility to fulfill there, that I have to do things on my side, but I'm also going to expect them to do things on their side. So I think, again, for the listeners out there, as if you're a security manager or director that's out there in the space and interviewing guard companies through an RFI and RFP process or whatever it is you're doing, really focus on what that relationship is going to look like. And to me, some of the things that I would be worried about is when I see companies really cut the wage rate for those security officers to be able to make a number that they're trying to throw out to you. That's a big red flag for me when I'm evaluating people, because I'm going to sit there and go, if you're going to treat your people that way, then I'm not sure that that's the partnership that I want. I want you to come in and say, hey, look, based upon the market in this environment, here's what we need to pay people to keep them.
Yes.
Let me know what the truth is. I don't hire security officers. You do. But don't sit there and say, well, hey, I can beat my next competitor by, reducing that rate $1 an hour. And that's borne on the back of the security officers because, at the end of the day, that penalizes me. I mean, again, cost is an issue. I'm not trying to say it's not. Cost is definitely an issue. But where I want to see you sharpen your pencil is on your margin. not on what the wage is for that security officer, because if you cut it too low, now my pool just keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and I'm going to get people that are not going to do what they need to do to support me. So, if we're talking about cost, I'm hoping that you're sharpening your pencil on that margin piece. And I know that's hard because you're running your own business and you've got.
We look at it from the opposite. I actually would rather take a lower margin and a higher wage because we have less turnover. You have soft costs in recruiting people and then also training them. And I would agree with you that, we're all hiring from the same pool of people. I think what also stands out as a difference is how much training we're putting into people, because I think that can be when you talk to companies and they go, what kind of training? Oh, we have a great training program. Well, that may be a 3-hour orientation video on how to get your paycheck, and here you go, see that. So I think what you invest in them is what you get out of it. And I think too, when you get into bidding scenarios and I think the industry is set up to, let's bid it to win the business, not to keep it. And that's when you start getting into numbers and going, how do I look attractive on paper to just get my foot in the door? And then, you have service issues from there, and you're just on your heels from that point on. So I think being as transparent as possible with wage, margin, what training costs and everything else go into it is kind of the name of the game. So when you came in to that position, it sounded like the program was somewhat fragmented with different vendors. Did you consolidate that into one vendor that was already providing service, or did you bring somebody new in? And secondary to that, was there a time you ever changed vendors during your tenure there, or were that the same vendor throughout?
So the consolidation actually happened right before I got there. So
Okay.
it happened maybe in 2004 or the end of 2004. I came in the October of 2005. So that had already occurred. And I think, I don't know this 100%, but I'm pretty sure that the vendor they chose was somewhat that already had part of the contract, not the entire contract. And so, that decision had already been made. And quite frankly, over the time that I spent there, there didn't seem to be a real reason to change back to a different model. And, we were able to make it work. I think the national account manager was key in that. I had some really good national account managers. And interestingly enough, two of the national account managers that I had over my tenure ended up being hired as proprietary for my company. They did such a wonderful job, and so that was really a testament in my mind to the guarding company that they selected some really top flight people that once I got them in my office, I realized pretty quickly I wanted them to be on my team to do different jobs, and one of those folks got promoted a couple of times and is doing really, really well, and the other one is relatively new, but I have every confidence will flourish in that environment. So there was really no reason for us to change. But the thing I learned in the procurement world is that, you've got to create an environment where there's competition out there in order to, kind of keep people honest. And so we went through multiple processes along the way where we took the contract and put it back out to the street and allowed people to bid and give us their best recommendation. And at the end of the day, I was fully prepared to change companies if that made sense, fiscal and logistical sense for the company. I was fully prepared to do that.
Nice. Well, and then getting into kind of the technology side, I mean, we talked a little bit before. We monitor some video cameras, and a lot of that was led from the copper theft trend that was starting. And I'm sure from the electric utility side, you were no shortage of copper thieves in your time. But just kind of starting that discussion of the technology side of this with managing cameras and vendors and remote video monitoring. I'd like to talk a little bit about that experience, but ultimately, I think the main point being the discussion behind how cyber and physical converge. From my side, I've seen throughout the years, it used to be you're either a physical man guarding provider or you're an integrator that does cameras, and those have been kind of siloed and separate. Now we're starting to see those things come together, but especially from a cyber standpoint, that really didn't exist, back in the day, and now it's a new thing, and trying to figure out, does that go to IT, does that go to the security department, physical, and how do those things come together? I think in your role, you saw those merge and roll up under physical security, but I would say that's almost an anomaly. I mean, most of the time we're talking with the cyber side's controlled by the IT department. Sometimes the right hand's not talking to the left, and it's a real struggle for security managers to kind of figure out how to navigate that discussion. But just kind of interested in your thoughts and in on the technology side.
So that's all spot on. I mean, the physical security world has become a technology world.
Yes.
And if you feel like that's not true, then you're probably in a very limited limited environment that doesn't rely on any kind of technology. I mean, from your access control system to cameras to any kind of sophisticated alarming systems that you have, it's all technology. It all requires support from your cyber team and ultimately your IT team. And with the Internet of Things, the networks have changed, the security of the networks have changed. So, the vendors are out there creating all of this really interesting new technology. And if you think about it, they're finding ways to scale up the Ring doorbell sort of scenarios to big companies.
Right.
And all that stuff, works wirelessly. And, so there is no shortage of opportunities for the threat actors to get into your physical technology that you're using to secure your facilities. What we did at AEP was really took the idea that security is security, whether it's physical security or cybersecurity. It's really about doing a couple of things. It's about protecting your assets. It's about protecting your people. And then it's about making sure that people have the right access to be able to do their job at the right time. And if you think about that, there's not really a lot of difference between making sure that someone can come into the physical office and do their job, or someone can get into a system
Right.
and do their job, right? It's the same mindset. Um, the way that you go about it may be very, very different. So please don't
Sure.
me say that I'm in any way, shape, or form um, uh, denigrating the role of these brilliant cybersecurity folks, and they are brilliant, and
Right.
I got to work with a lot of great ones. But what we ended up deciding to do was we decided to put the security team together into one converged organization. And that really did a couple of things for us. One, it allowed us to brand security one time. So when we created our operations center, that operations center we actually started doing this before we actually formally brought the teams together, but they fielded every call that was security related, whether it was a cybersecurity call or a physical security call, it didn't
Wow.
matter. It's a security issue. When we did training, we were able to have one brand. We were able to create a security message that included all kinds of different things relative to security. The other thing that was important in my mind was we pulled the cybersecurity team from underneath the technology organization or the IT organization, and we were able to put it somewhere else. And as the new CSO, as the new chief security officer responsible for both sides of that, that allowed me to have a voice that was different from what had happened in the past. Most companies, the IT security organization has got its own silo, and
Yep.
physical security organization's got another silo, and oftentimes those two things don't meet in the middle. So the counsel that I would give to security directors that are in that space is that if you're the physical security person, you better have a great relationship with your cybersecurity team, because they're the ones
Yeah.
that are going to be able to help you with the IT issues around the network issues, the bandwidth issues that you might need for the cameras or for the technology that you're installing. They need to have a voice in the technology that you're choosing.
Right.
Because there is technology out there that is better than other.
Right.
And as a physical person, I probably don't have the requisite skill set to be able to really evaluate that in a meaningful way, at least in the way my cyber team is going to look at it. And so that it needs to be a partnership. We took the partnership sort of to the extreme and literally fully integrated the organization. And and it worked. And it worked. It's still that way. The organization got moved back under the technology group, but the CSO that's there now still has physical and cyber, and is responsible for both sides of the equation. So,
Oh.
I saw a lot of benefit in doing it, and I certainly learned a tremendous amount from my cybersecurity team. But we saw so many crossovers, something like insider threat.
Right.
Well, insider threat can be a physical issue just as easily as it can be a cyber issue.
Right.
When we think about access control, we're thinking about access control from the perimeter of the building or specific locations inside the building, and then we're thinking about the applications and the systems that people are allowed to work in. And at the end of the day, it's the same concept. It's just using different tools to protect yourself. So I think our physical security team has learned a ton from the cybersecurity team, and I believe the cybersecurity team also learned from the physical security team. And it's now been 7 years that the organization has been converged, and it's still going strong. And it works for us. I don't suggest that.
Well, no, I was going to ask how long that had been going, because I see so many even not have the discussion until it becomes a problem. But now you're seeing those things come together where, you're hearing reports of it's easier to physically walk in a building, throw a jump drive into a computer and get on a network through than it is to try and get, penetrate the network from outside of it or do it. I mean, we've even used the 0-day virus and different stuff it's just a different landscape. And I think there's no way to kind of keep those siloed anymore. Those are together and having those conversations. So that's, you're unique in that sense. I can't think of others that I've really heard of that kind of put those things together. Usually it lives under IT and those are just separate conversations, and it's really tough to figure out who's who. But I think the advice of making friends with them and having open lines of communication and working as a partner as opposed to a boat anchor is, extremely important in that.
Well, at the end of the day, what you've got to make sure of is that, and you talked about the integrators, the integrators will come to see a guy like me who's a physical security guy and say, hey, I've got this great technology for you. But if I can't sell that technology to my own internal cyber and IT and networking team, then, we're all wasting our time. So
Right.
I used to do when I had those conversations with the vendors, I invite the cyber people to the table. Let's talk about it right out of the gate. Tell them, because they're going to ask different questions. I'm asking operational questions. Well, how is this going to work when, this person tries to access this facility? They're asking about, okay, well, how much bandwidth is this going to take? The bandwidth is not important to me, but they know, because they work with a networking team, that at the building that I might want to put this, there's already a bandwidth problem. And if I'm asking them to stream live video, guess what? It's not going to happen. Because
that's when you become the boat anchor as opposed to giving them a voice in the conversation. No, that's great.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, if we're trying to win as a corporation, as an organization, not just the physical security team got this done. Because if I can't recruit them to help me make good decisions, and they also feel empowered then, because they're going to get their questions answered. And sometimes, to be perfectly candid with you, some of those vendors were flat-footed and they couldn't answer the questions. And then when I talked to my cyber team later on, they'd go, boss, you probably don't want to go down this path. Because we asked these guys some pretty basic questions about how they're going to protect our data or how they're going to do this and that, and they didn't have really good answers. So they might have a really cool, widget,
right?
But when you put this to scale and you put it across our whole company, we're inviting a lot of risk that we don't need, and that's a fair point. And I would not have known that in my role as a physical security director. So, like I said, it's huge for you to create that partnership and make sure that you're all on the same page.
No, that's great advice. Well, so you retired not too long ago, and I know you spoke at GSX, and I know you gave a presentation on employee terminations, and I'm kind of interested now in what are you up to these days, or how you spending your time?
So I'm being a grandpa, which is awesome, and I highly recommend that. And but you really focusing on. I put together a little consulting company and haven't done a whole lot of work. But one of the things I really want to focus on is trying to help people make the transition. And that was why I was so blessed to be on Carlos's podcast, and also to help people think about security from a leadership and a risk management perspective. At the end of the day, I find that that people that go into the first responder community or the military, it's about service, right? And so I don't want to stop doing that because I think the day I stop doing that, I'm going to get old really fast, and I don't really want to do that. The other passion that I have, and I know there's going to be some folks on that are listening to this podcast that are in the first responder community. The other passion I have is making sure the first responders are taking care of themselves. And I'm honored to be a member of an organization called the First Responders Bridge, which is really designed to focus on first responder mental health. And it crushes me in that I'm the middle of 3 generations of police officers, and I'm very proud of the service that my family has offered in the law enforcement community. But it crushes me to think that over the last few years, we have more police officers that are dying by their own hand that are being killed in the line of duty. That should never happen. And so for your listeners out there, I would say, take care of yourselves, ask for help if you need it. There is help out there in ways that never existed during my career, or certainly during my father's career. And I want to see everybody be healthy, and you deserve to be happy. You deserve to have a great career. You deserve to have what I like to call the LAPD. For some reason, that made Carlos laugh, and he laughed about it more than once. But LAPD to me is not Los Angeles Police Department. It's life after police department.
Yeah.
When you're 48 or 50 or 52 years old or 55 years old, and you're thinking about retiring, you got a lot of life left to live. So the way you take care of yourself physically and mentally, and prepare yourself maybe even to transition into another career, could really make a huge difference in the quality of your life and the quality of your family's life going forward. So I'm really, really passionate about that. And I'm always happy to help people. Contact me on LinkedIn. Look up First Responders Bridge on LinkedIn.
Well, I'll throw a link to that organization in the description of the video, and then I'll also throw your LinkedIn profile if anybody's wanting to get in touch with you that way. But that's a great organization. And 2, I think that doesn't get talked about enough. After you leave law enforcement, you have that thin blue line and you're in that world, and then you leave, and it can be a lonely place sometimes, because that's your whole life and identity. And how do you figure out how to make that transition is a big part of it.
You are spot on. I think we thought over the last, say, 15 years, as we've started to develop this idea of taking better care of ourselves and making sure that our officers and firefighters and military folks are taken care of, because we know post-traumatic stress is real, and we also know that anybody that's been in the business for any period of time has experienced it on a level. Some people more than others, but you can't get out of that world, even if you only did it for a couple of years, without being touched by it. I mean, I knew a guy when I was in the FBI that, and I chuckle, but I don't mean it in a disrespectful way, but literally he got shot his first day on the job. First day on the job. He goes out with his training agent to go interview somebody at a bank robbery, and unfortunately the bank robbery was still in progress, and as they're walking up to the bank, the bad guy comes out and literally shoots this guy day one. So you never know what's going to happen in that kind of career, no matter what agency you work for, how big, how small, it doesn't make any difference. We all know that. But to your point, one of the things that we're seeing now is we never really thought about that sort of residual stress effect that happens to retirees and to people that transition into other careers, maybe mid-career. Maybe you were a police officer for 10, 12 years and you transition and you go into another career. That stuff never leaves you.
That's
so
100%. Yep.
We are fighting that battle in a different way and thinking about it in a different way. Another one that I'll throw out for you is a really very special lady named Amanda Coleman, who is the Irish Angel. She runs a not-for-profit called Irish Angel, and she and her team are now starting to talk about that idea of making sure we continue to take care of people even when they transition out of the business, because those scars that we all carry, they never leave, and so figuring out a way to manage through that and have the relationships that you want to have with your family, and enjoy the rest of your life is important. So I hope that all of you that are listening, that are part of the military or first responder community, will take care of yourselves, that you'll ask for help. There's lots of different organizations out there now that are trying to help you and don't feel like you're alone, and
Right.
don't feel like you're so macho that you can't go ask for help.
That's a
Because
tough one.
that is a tough one, and we've
Yep.
all been there. We've all seen it, and we've all seen either ourselves do it or people that we worked with internalize the stuff and eat it and never ask for help. And when you doing okay, I'm fine, I'm good. I've got my Superman or Superwoman cape on, and I don't need anybody to help me. But the reality is, this stuff is real. And again, to me, the tragedy. Again, when you think about, over my career, I lost friends in the line of duty. But honestly, in my 25-year career, I only knew of one officer in my career that committed suicide. That statistic is not happening today. It's
Right.
it's much more than that, and so that's one of the things I'm hugely passionate about.
And Irish Angel, I'll throw that link in there too, because when you were talking about that, I was kind of thinking about that, and I'm like, when you're at the department, you have at least availability to some resources.
That's true.
When you're gone, what do you got? There's no veterans affair for retired cops or ex-cop. I mean, it's sometimes you don't have those resources to reach out to. So that's a great one that if you're, out of it. So I definitely want to link that up too as well. Well, I have really enjoyed the conversation. You've got an incredibly impressive background and certainly some great insight for security managers and directors and folks that are looking at a transition out of law enforcement. But really appreciate you coming on and really appreciate you sharing the conversation. I certainly enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you for what you're doing to try to, get these conversations happening out there. We as a community need to do more to help each other out, and whether that's helping somebody from a mental health perspective or helping somebody transition. And Carlos and I had a great time talking about that. And one of the things that I think you did through our conversation is we didn't just focus on that initial transition. It's not only transitioning, but how do I become effective in that role? And
Right.
there's work that has to be done there, because you're going to learn as you go along, as I'm sure you did when you transitioned out and you went into the guarding business. I'm sure that the Ryan of today would have some very important lessons for the Ryan of day
I say that all the time. It's blind ignorance. I got into this business thinking I knew, I was a cop and I can do all this stuff. Had I known what I know now, I probably would have never done it because I had so much to learn. It was just ignorant to do, and I kind of found out. But
but the beauty of it, honestly, the beauty of it, and I applaud you, is that you're willing to share that with other people.
Right.
And that's huge. And I think that's part of our community, right? That's what we do for each other. And, and so I'm always happy to do that. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for what you're doing. And my best to you and your family. Be safe out there.
I appreciate it. Stay safe. Thanks again for coming on.